The IMF Tune quarantine and reporting system relies on a Microsoft SQL Server database backend. Today, we demonstrate the basic SQL Server setup when running behind a firewall. We configure the database server and open the necessary ports for IMF Tune to work. IMF Tune supports all Microsoft SQL versions from 2000, 2005 and 2008. It also supports the free SQL Express 2005 and 2008 editions. My test machines will be set up as shown here. SQL is on one side of the firewall. The IMF Tune server and moderator components are on the other side. Before starting, let me highlight an important requirement. The IMF Tune moderator must be run on the same Windows domain as the SQL server, otherwise it won't install correctly. This requirement does not apply to the IMF Tune server component. This can be run on a different Windows domain or on a server that is not part of any domain. We start with SQL 2008 Express R2. Later, I will show you how the same configuration steps also apply to SQL 2005 and 2000. Here, I am installing SQL on a fresh machine, having no other SQL server installed. For brevity, we skip the initial part of the installation and go straight to the option selection stage. As a minimum, we require the database engine service and the management tools. Next, we choose between a default instance and a named instance. As we shall see, this choice makes a big difference when it comes to the firewall setup. You can only have one default SQL instance per server, but you can have multiple named instances. The default instance is easier to set up, so we start with that. IMF Tune requires the SQL server to allow both Windows and SQL authentication. Thus, we choose mixed mode and set the SA account password. We now just let the installation complete. I will now switch to a machine where the IMF Tune server is already installed. To activate quarantine and reporting, we have to also download and install the quarantine component. At the end, the installation starts the quarantine database connection wizard. In case the wizard encounters any problems, this can be closed and restarted from the IMF Tune quarantine program group. Let me try connecting to the SQL server. Since we installed the default SQL instance, we reference it using the machine name. Here, the name must be entered manually for two reasons. For one, the firewall is still blocking SQL connectivity. Secondly, I did not enable the SQL browser service, so auto-discovery wouldn't work in any case. As expected, this fails. Let's fix it. We start from the SQL Server Configuration Manager. Under SQL Server Network Configuration, the TCP/IP protocol has to be enabled. Next, check the port SQL is binding to. 1433. We will need to open it at the firewall. Before that, I restart the SQL server. Finally, we open TCP 1433. Here, I am using the Windows firewall. Of course, you can do the same with any other firewall. Switching back to the IMF Tune database connection wizard, we now completed successfully. The IMF Tune database is now initialized. To conclude, we also register the IMF Tune server to the database, establishing a connection for uploading email information. Again, we enter the server name manually, since the SQL browser service is not enabled. Note how I use the SA account rather than Windows authentication. This is most useful in case the IMF Tune server is not running on the same domain as the SQL server. So far, we saw how to configure a default SQL instance. Let's see what happens in case of a named instance. I choose named instance and keep the suggested name SQL Express. This time we enable the SQL browser server. This is useful when exposing named SQL instances through a firewall. Jumping to the end of the installation, we enable TCP/IP and open the port configuration. By default, named instances bind to a port selected dynamically on startup. In fact, no port is configured. This is a problem when it comes to firewall configuration, so we change it to a fixed port. A very common choice for this purpose is TCP port 14330. Set this by removing the 0 from TCP dynamic ports and enter 14330 under TCP port. Repeat the same for all IP entries. Lastly, we open the firewall ports. This time we have two ports to open. UDP port 1434 for the SQL browser service and TCP port 14330 for the SQL server. The browser service here is necessary in order to publish the newly set SQL server port. At the IMF Tune database connection wizard, we now get the SQL instance name. This confirms connectivity to the SQL browser service. Also note how the SQL server is now identified, using both machine name and instance name. Let's recap. Here, I will show you how to verify an already installed SQL server and change any settings for it to work with IMF Tune. To begin, ensure TCP/IP is enabled. And the SQL server is binding to a fixed port for all IPs. We already saw how to do this. If the port was immediately fixed to 1433, we are dealing with a default SQL instance. Otherwise, we have a named instance. In that case, we make sure the SQL browser service is enabled, set to automatic and running. Next, we move to the SQL Server Management Studio. At the server properties, we ensure both SQL and Windows authentication are allowed. Enabling the SA login is not required, but can be handy, especially if the IMF Tune server and SQL are not members of the same domain. To enable it, set the SA password and change the status to enabled. Once the IMF Tune database initialization steps are completed, we can just disable this again from here. Lastly, open the ports for the SQL server and if enabled for the browser service. At the end, don't forget to restart the SQL Server service for changes to be applied. Now let's have a look at the other SQL Server versions supported by IMF Tune. As you shall see, in all cases the same settings are involved. Here is the SQL Express 2005 installation. We have the choice between default and named instances. Option to enable the browser service, selection of mixed mode authentication, and setting of the SA account password. Once the setup completes, we enable TCP/IP from the SQL Server Surface Area configuration. From the Server Configuration Manager, we verify and set the port to a fixed value, just like we did in SQL 2008. Lastly, we open the firewall ports. Again, nothing new here. One difference from SQL Express 2008 is the fact that the Management Studio interface is a separate download. Once installed, you can verify that mixed mode authentication is enabled and configure the SA account exactly as we did in the SQL Express 2008 demo. The last server we will demonstrate is SQL 2000. IMF Tune requires Service Pack 4 to be installed. Again, the installation gives us nearly the same set of options. Selection between default and named instances. Selection of mixed mode authentication, and setting of the SA account password. I won't configure this here, so that I can show you later on how to do it from the Enterprise Manager. However, if you were doing a fresh install, configure these here straight away. Once the install completes, we go to the SQL Server Manager and start the SQL Server which is initially not running. Next, from the Server Network Utility, we confirm that TCP/IP is enabled and take a look at the port configuration. Since I installed a named instance, the port is set to 0. Thus, we change it to 14330. Now, from the Enterprise Manager, at the Server Security Properties, we enable SQL Authentication. From the server logins, we set the SA password. There is no enablement switch for this login. We only have to set the password. Lastly, we open the firewall ports. Again, the default instance uses TCP/1433, and named instances bind to the TCP port we specify at the Server Network Utility. Note how we did not mention the SQL browser service. In SQL 2000, this functionality is implemented by the SQL Server Resolution Protocol. This protocol runs within the SQL 2000 server service. Just like the browser service, it binds to UDP1434, so we open this port if running an SQL 2000 named instance. This concludes our video tutorial. Today, we walked through the setup and configuration of various SQL database servers. We configured these so as to facilitate firewall configuration. We encourage you to download our 30-day evaluation and try IMF Tune out. Also, check the links shown here for more IMF Tune video tutorials. Until then, thanks for watching.